Good evening. I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. But I want to begin first by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you tonight is the territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Tonight, we'll be exploring the serious decline in investigative journalism Canada. Not a decline in quality, but in the amount being undertaken by Canadian media outlets. Why is this happening? What does it mean for public discourse and for Canadian democracy? What can and is being done to deal with the issue? We have a superb panel who will be discussing these and related questions. But before I introduce them, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight, which are the Canadian Association of Journalists, PEN Canada, and the Toronto Metropolitan University Journalism Research Centre. Thank you to all of you. In introducing our panel, as I was preparing it, I noticed I was using the term award-winning in relation to each of them. They all are quite remarkable investigative journalists. And so I will forego saying award-winning for each of them, but they all are. The first is Rob Cribb. I can't even talk now, is Rob Cribb. Rob is an internationally recognized and highly respected investigative journalist at the Toronto Star. He's the founder and director of the Investigative Journalism Bureau at the University of Toronto, and is the founder of the National Student Investigative Reporting Network. Welcome, Rob.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our second panelist is Allya Davidson. She's also an impressive investigative journalist who is the executive producer of CBC News's flagship investigative documentary program, The Fifth Estate. And if I'm correct, Allya, I think this is the 50th anniversary of The Fifth Estate. So it's not only probably the premier investigative journalism program, media program in Eastern Canada, or in English Canada, but also has been around the longest of any. Allya has produced documentaries for Vice and CTV's W5, and internationally for Channel 4 in the UK, ZDF in Germany, Four Corners in Australia, and PBS Frontline in the United States. Welcome, Allya.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I should say oldest now, now that W5 is gone, but we'll get to that tonight.
We shall. Our third panelist is Marie-Maude Denis. She is the host of Enquete, Radio Canada Television's investigative program. Her reporting on corruption and collusion in the Quebec construction industry helped lead to the creation of the Charbonneau Commission, and she was the center of a test case at the Supreme Court of Canada, which won a historic legal battle for journalists' right to protect confidential sources. Welcome, Marie-Maude.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Very glad to be there.
And our fourth panelist is Cecil Rosner. Cecil is the managing editor of the Investigative Journalism Foundation, and he's an adjunct professor at the University of Winnipeg. He has worked for print, broadcast, and online media, including a 31-year stint at the CBC. So he has broad experience as an investigative journalist. Welcome, Cecil.
Thanks, Jim.
Our fifth panelist was going to be Anton Koucheni, who is the former executive producer of CTV's W5, but unfortunately he's not able to be with us tonight. Moderating this panel is an equally impressive investigative journalist, Julian Sher. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression and a former investigative journalist at the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and the CBC, where he was the senior producer of Fifth Estate. Welcome, Julian.
Good to be here, Jim. Well,
I just want to explain for the audience briefly the format we're going to follow this evening. The panel will have a discussion for 45 to 55 minutes, after which we'll turn to the audience to allow you to join the discussion. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. The chat is not operational in this version of Zoom, but the Q&A button, if you click on that, you can write a question, and we'd encourage you, as questions come to mind, to post them as soon as you think of them. When Julian turns to the audience to participate in the conversation, he'll ask Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression, to read out the first question, which she will do. So I'd really encourage you to, in the audience, to feel free to participate actively in the conversation, to raise questions, particularly tough questions. These are good journalists, so they'd appreciate tough questions. Then we'll get to those, but enter those questions as you go along. So that's all for me. I'll sign off, and it's over to you, Julian and panel.
Well, welcome everybody. We've been doing these panels for the last 2 or 3 years, everything from the war against journalists in Afghanistan, Russia, around the world. But I must say, this is a topic that is very close to my heart. It says something about the size of investigative journalism in Canada, that all 5 of us know each other. And in one way or another, we've all worked together as well. So I'm really looking forward to this session. For the audience, we're going to start off with an overview of the situation right now, and in many ways the collapse, but there are some bright spots. And then we're going to look at where things are right now, especially what are the challenges and risks of government support. And finally, we'll devote a lot of time to what are some of the solutions. But as Jim said, we really want you in the audience to participate, really fire away at those questions. This is a chance for you to speak and ask directly questions of some of the top journalists in the country. All right, let's get started. And Allya, I think you're a good place to start, because you spent many years at the Fifth Estate, but then you went to Vice News, which back then was flourishing and doing a lot of investigations. Then you went to CTV's W5, one of the most venerable operations in the country. But those paths are not available to a young person today. So what is a young person to do when the doors that were open to you are now largely closed?
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, big question. I'm obviously cursed. Everywhere I leave is then canceled after I go. That's the first takeaway. But you know, W5 seemed like it would be around forever. I think externally it was, I think, season 58 when it was finally canceled in this past spring. It was almost 60 years old. But I'll say on the inside, we joked every year at Upfronts, you know, are we going to get canceled? Is this the year we're not going to make it? Because it was clear that, you know, the profit motives, and it was a market-driven show, and we needed to make money. We needed to do more than break even. We did that for the entire time I was at the show, both as a producer and senior producer. But it was always a question, you know, will we be back next year? Vice was a bit of a different scenario where, you know, flush with cash, we were able to try things and do really creative things. But I think anyone who had worked at Vice during that period was not surprised when the company declared bankruptcy, because it just simply wasn't sustainable to have a good idea and be on a plane the next day for weeks at a time without a necessary, you know, destination for the content. It was exciting and it was great to work on it, but it just wasn't financially sustainable. And we could see that from the inside for sure. So I know that sounds really dark, and that's not advice for the young people, but the thing that has always driven me and continues to drive me is to focus on the sort of work I want to do and the calling, less so than a title or a job, corporation, a show. None of those things have ever driven me. It's the sort of work I want to do, and to know that I'm going to do that every day. Because investigative journalism is hard. It's not glamorous. So it is something you have to really have a passion for and a calling for. So if you have that, then I think you have to self-anoint a little bit now. Young people come to me a lot because of the job I'm in, and that's the advice I give. Investigative journalist is a verb. It's not a noun. So if you are curious about something, look into it. You can't sort of wait for someone to come say, okay, you're an investigative journalist now, go look into this. And I've seen a lot of great success with young people in our newsroom, even here, where they get a day turn story and they think, well, there might be something else here. It's that urge to say there might be something else here, and to actually dig into it, not wait for the permission to do so, that makes people into investigative journalists. And that avenue is still available. You can still do that. It's not all 1 hour documentary or nothing. There's still that ability to pursue that nugget, peel back that next layer. And so you can still do that if that's your calling. I'd say if it's not, don't force it.
It's interesting. I mean, I think few Canadians might know that I believe W5 predated 60 Minutes.
Yes, by 2 years.
As kind of the news magazine in North America, and the fact that it would be abolished and that Vice News, it just shows how the landscape has dramatically changed. Cecil, you've written books and you've been in the industry. Give us an overview of the situation in the print media in Canada today overall, in terms of the cutbacks, but also specifically the investigative units that used to exist in so many newspapers.
Sure, and apologies in advance for continuing for a little while anyway, some of the doom and gloom, but I think we all recognize there's a crisis here. There's just no question about it. I mean, the local news research project has identified 500 closures of news outlets in the last 15 or 16 years.
500 closures of newspapers or magazines in the country,
and news outlets of all kinds.
Wow.
But and now it's sad, but in a way, no surprise that you can have, for instance, Kamloops this week being nominated for a Michener Award 1 week, and then a few months later, the newspaper shuts down. We've seen what has happened to some of the different newspaper chains. I started my career at the Winnipeg Free Press many years ago. It was a big newsroom, it was a robust place. We had multiple people covering the legislature and City Hall. We had a correspondent in Ottawa and Washington and Northern Manitoba. I think the Winnipeg Free Press today is maybe the only newspaper left in Western Canada that even still has a physical newsroom.
Wow.
And so we know what's happened with the Post media chain. We know what's happened with a lot of the newspaper assets. Of course, there still are bright spots. We'll talk about that. But overall, the situation has deteriorated. When I was doing some research for a book I wrote last year, I wanted to know exactly. My book was about manipulating messaging. And how even journalists are manipulated. And so I wanted to know how many journalists, what was the quotient of journalists to PR and communications people over the years? And I just find this stat so telling about where we are today. In 1991, there were 13,000 reporters in Canada, which, if you think about it, is kind of a shockingly low number anyway. And at the same time, there were about 24,000 people who said they're in PR communications. That was in 1991. And then 30 years later, in 2021, the number of reporters has declined, in spite of the huge increase in the Canadian population, to 11,000. But the number of people who say they work in public relations and communications has gone up to 160,000. So
Wow.
you have this army of people on one side trying to influence messaging, trying to influence journalists, and you have a shrinking number of people who are trying to report the news, make sense of the news. I mean, that's journalism overall. If we want to talk about investigative journalism specifically, if you look back over the last 50 or so or 60 years, I think you can always see that investigative teams and journalism has gone up and down, often related to what's going on in the economy. When times are good, teams get funded. When times are bad, teams get cut back. And the reason is that a lot of the big employers see investigative journalism as optional. They think breaking news is the meat and potatoes. Covering press releases, covering press conferences, that's what we must do. And if we have a little bit of extra money left over, maybe we can do a little bit of investigative journalism. And when the crisis hits, when the economy starts tanking, when Google and Facebook start sucking all the ad dollars out of the system, then there's a temptation to cut back on those things that are not considered essential. And I think I think that's a false paradigm. I think that's something that actually has to change. But if you actually look at what's gone on over the decades, you can almost chart the rise and fall of investigative teams and investments into investigative journalism in relation to that. And we're at a point right now where economically things are very bad. And so I think that's, with the exception of the things we're going to talk about, you know, the people on this call, the teams that exist, it's not looking that great in a lot of places in Canada right now.
No, that is gloomy, but I think quite accurate. You know, I think most people watching this tonight and later on the recorded version, you know, you still get your newspaper if you actually subscribe and it comes on your doorstep in the morning, or you obviously subscribe online. Most people can see the deterioration, but I think few people realize the scope of the decimation. My wife used to work at the Montreal Gazette 20 years ago. They had over 220 staff in their newsroom, reporters, photographers, editors, right? They now have a little over 20, right? When I was president of the CAJ, Canadian Association of Journalists, in 1990, you know, we gave out annual awards for investigative journalism, and they still do. And there's amazing stories being done. But I remember we went around and we interviewed the candidates. There were investigative units at the Montreal Gazette, the Ottawa Citizen, the Winnipeg papers, the Vancouver papers, right? Now you don't see that. And I'll always remember Paul Godfrey, the you know, at the time, the head of Post Media, was interviewed once about the cutbacks, and he said, he was asked about the deteriorating quality of papers like the Vancouver Sun and the Gazette, and he said, well, they're not unacceptable. I've always loved that, not unacceptable. He didn't even have the courage to say acceptable, right? He said not not quite democracy dies in darkness, right? Or all the news that's fit the print, right? Can you imagine if all the newspapers in Canada said not unacceptable, right? That's their slogan. Well, before people start slashing their wrists or canceling what few subscriptions they have left, we do have a couple of bright spots in Canada. In print, Rob Cribb works at the Toronto Star, along with the Globe and Mail, one of the few newspapers that has an investigative team. And in fact, as Rob will explain, in many ways, the Star has two investigative units or branches. Rob, what has contributed to the Star's success? Why is it such an exception?
I just think from day one, that's how the newspaper was built. It was founded by a guy who had these, Joseph Atkinson, who had these convictions. It was a social justice paper from day one. And investigations have forever been woven into the DNA of the place. And it's real. These Atkinson principles, I remember when I came to the Star, people explained this to me. And I thought, you know, whatever, right? Like it's a quaint conceit. But it's real, like it's a real thing, and it pervades selection of stories and the choice to invest heavily in long form journalism. The Star is by no means exempt from the economic turmoil for sure, but we've never scaled back on the I team. Today it's 5 or 6 people, and you know. It's almost sacrosanct, this idea that you would kill it. I mean, there's whispers of it that have come and gone over the years, or even just reducing it. It's never been a serious deliberation or conversation, certainly not to my knowledge. It is just too vital to the identity of the paper. I think it must be getting, and I know nothing about the economics of that, but clearly it must be a challenge to maintain it. There's no question about that, particularly because investigative units do stories that are problematic and fraught, legally fraught, and you know, anger advertisers. You know, like not only are they expensive, and not only are the stories often speculative, like you can go down rabbit holes and end up with, you could spend hundreds of hours on stories that ultimately never publish. So economically, they're indefensible. They're the first thing that the accountants would identify as being an easy slash, right? Why are you paying this reporter for 3 months to do a story when you could send him or her out to press conferences and they could file 3 times a day. Like it makes no economic sense, right? And they're right about that. So it is an act of goodwill. It's an act of conviction. It's a true, I mean, the Star is a true believer that this is, it is not optional. It is the core reason that we exist.
And Rob, just for any people watching who will see your byline or other investigative stories along with the daily news, you might typically spend 4, 5, 6 months or longer on a big investigation. Is that right?
Yeah, not, I mean, you're juggling 2, 3, 4 sometimes, but yeah, for sure. We just published a story last month that I'm actually sheepish to say it was 4 years in the making. It took us 4 years. Now, not to be clear, not consistently. It dies, sources disappear, they reemerge, you court them, you end up, you get in the Tim Hortons with them, and eventually it'll come back. But I mean, it took that long to get the sufficient number of sources on the record to be able to tell that story. And we just stuck with it. I mean, you can't, it's a hard thing to do.
And tomorrow on the CFE webpage, we'll post a lot of links so people can see the work that Rob and also Cecil and of course the Fifth Estate have done. Now, I want to introduce Marie-Maude to the audience, especially if most of our audience, I assume because of the language, are from English Canada. Marie-Maude may not be a household name in Canada, but she is famous here in Montreal, where I am, and in Quebec. Enquete is you can't even call it the English equivalent of the Fifth Estate or 60 Minutes because it is so much more popular. Quebec has a population of 8 million, and at times when they have a huge expose, like 1 out of every 4 people is watching Enquete. You can't walk down the street with Marie-Maude.
We're the English Enquete, to be clear.
That's right.
That's to it.
So
I think you're mildly exaggerating, but it's fine.
Just a bit. It is huge. And Marie-Maude, I want to ask you, because again, for people who don't know the situation here in Quebec, Enquete, of course, is hugely popular, but the Journal de Montréal, the tabloid, the equivalent of the Toronto Sun or all the Sun newspapers, regularly publishes investigations. La Presse has gone completely digital, but has an I-team, and of course, Enquete is flourishing. So Marie-Maude, aside from the water and maybe the fine wine in Quebec, what is the secret? Why is investigative journalism doing so well in Quebec?
Okay, well, thank you all. I just want to say how much I feel for all of our, our colleagues, journalists that have lost their job or cannot be employed in a regular way in what they want to do in journalism, because I feel in my heart how hard it must be, because this is one of it's a great, I feel a huge privilege to be able to be an investigative journalist in these days. Just a brief history, because you say we're so hugely popular in Quebec that we have like a very, very large audience. It is quite remarkable in Quebec that we have kind of like a star system around the investigative journalists. And I think there's roots in our relatively recent history. When I joined the Enquete team like 15 years ago, it was a show, it was a current affairs show called Enjeu, which which had some investigation, but more into social affairs. And then under Jean Pelletier and Alain Saunier, 2 great bosses, they turned it into Enquête. And it's like if your show would be called Investigation, and people would laugh at that and say, who's going to seriously say that you call and say, hey, hi, I'm from Investigation, and that's our brand. And everybody thought it was a huge joke that it would last 1 year. And over the years, we fell on that huge bone that we could just, you know, we fell into the story of a construction. And just to give you kind of an equivalent, it's like the Greenbelt scandal if, you know, all the medias in Ontario would be on the same subject for months and months and months, and every day, like competitors, like you know, the Toronto Star, and then CBC, and then CTV, and then everybody would compete, but on the same subject. So it branded this construction scandal, which has had links to organized crime, to political illegal financing, and that's the special spice. Every time something gets political, it gets really exciting for people. And it had roots in the construction, and everybody has an opinion on why should the roads be blocked or not. So everybody has an opinion on construction, whether they know it or not. So it gave a huge impulse to investigative journalism in Quebec. Not only our show became very popular, but the La Presse, who was reporting on those stories for years, but you know, hidden somewhere between page 46 and page 48 once in a while, they branded this investigation team. And then Québécois, all the private media came out with the investigation bureau. It was smoking hot. So it created kind of a star system in Quebec around the investigative journalists. And we have this huge show on Sunday nights called Tout le monde en parle. It's a talk show with like pop stars, actors, you know, comedians, and they invite us, investigative journalists, like with big hair, big makeup, and nice clothes, with all like the A stars, to say, yeah, we revealed this story and that story, and it's a huge conversation, you know.
And just to explain, this would be like, you know, investigative journalists going on like the Stephen Colbert show, right? This is a massive social event every Sunday.
Kind of, yeah, kind of.
And they treat the investigative journalists as stars.
Yeah, so I still feel, and you know, I would be, there's a lot of reasons to be very pessimist or very sad about what's going on, but I just last weekend I was at our annual journalist congress in Trois-Rivières, and I see still like amazing stories coming out, and not like only Radio-Canada, it's like Québécois, Journal de Montréal, and all the private medias. And there's been huge changes in our landscape. Did you know that we had Le Soleil in Quebec City, La Tribune in Sherbrooke, Le Nouvelliste in Trois-Rivières, and Le Droit in the Ottawa-Gatineau region? They became a big co-op. The employees bought the newspapers, and they have one platform for everybody now. So that's a huge change in the landscape. La Presse, as far as I know, I think not the subscription, but they became a nonprofit. I think it's working kind of well. They seem to be pretty satisfied. I'm not into their numbers. Québécois, well, they slashed, like they cut 500 jobs last year. It's very sad, but they don't seem to be taking away any resources from the investigative bureau. So that's telling, because I think like we're still an ingredient that calls for trust of the public. That will be all for now.
And the other obvious point is, of course, the French language, that the Quebec media in French is not competing against the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, 60 Minutes. So you know that helps a tremendous amount. Well,
we're a close-knit society, and I think on the left and the right of Quebec, there's not that much of a difference maybe that elsewhere in Canada. I'll let that hang for a minute.
And the other thing, I mean, we were joking about, the star system in Quebec, but if you look at in part because of the attacks by Trump and Republicans, enemies of the people, but even here in Canada, if you look at the respect for journalists, it's gone down tremendously in America, also in Canada, but not in Quebec, in part because of the French culture from France and elsewhere, the worship or the idealization of intellectuals and intellectual ideas. It really helps the Quebec media. All right, well, we've kind of had bad news, but also good news. Let's move on to the situation today. And what is remarkable is that if you had told any of us 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, that newspapers, CBC and Radio Canada were always going to be funded by the government, but that newspapers across Canada and most of the media would be increasingly reliant on millions and millions of dollars of government funding through the Canadian Periodical Fund and the Local Journalism Initiative and various tax credits. None of us would have believed it. Rob and Cecil, can you talk about how important this lifeline is? But also, I think we have to look at, is there a risk there? Because suddenly we're now dependent on financing from a government that we often investigate. Rob, how significant is the financial dependence on these new government subsidies?
Oh, it's big. It's significant. Yeah. I mean, every newsroom in the country is getting that money. It subsidizes the salaries of reporters significantly, without which you think it's bad now. If that disappeared tomorrow, I mean, then we're into complete decimation. I mean, it's
Really?
unfathomable what would happen if that disappeared tomorrow. And which is a very real possibility as we await the next election, right? And a prospective new prime minister who's unabashed in his criticism of this kind of support. So you're right, it has come, I mean, you and I have been around a long time. We were both president of the CAJ. These issues came up when we were president around taking money from government. And I'll never, I mean, without question, it wasn't just distasteful. Like it was a source of fistfights, these kinds of, the notion that we'd be taking that kind of money. But you know, we've come around, like it's an incredible, it's been a remarkable rationalization to come around to this idea that not only are we going to accept it, we're going to accept it in big numbers, and we're going to use it to effectively finance our newsrooms. Now the arguments, you know, like there are arguments about this. The CBC, one of the finest journalistic institutions in our country, has always been funded by government, and there's no evidence that they have in any way ever backed down or shied away from. Right, so there are examples of this that are defensible, but in terms of the extent and scope of it, it's huge. This is how we are continuing to exist today and pay the people that we have left. Those numbers that Cecil mentioned earlier are, of course, disturbing and tragic, but they are the actual numbers that would exist without this financing. I just can't imagine.
Yeah. Cecil, can you give us a sense of the scope? What are we talking about? Where is this money coming from? How important is it?
No, I mean, there's a suite of government programs. There's a tax credit that funds many of the reporters in many outlets right now. There's the Local Journalism Initiative that is inserting reporters into underserved areas and underserved projects. So the government has poured a lot of money into journalism. But I think the good thing that this raises is maybe a conversation about, is journalism a public good?
Mm.
Is it something that is worthwhile for the public, i.e. society through its government, to support? And I would say, well, why not? It does
sort of like hospitals, schools, and
schools, museums, roads, you name it, our cultural industries. The government has forever funded our cultural industries. Unlike Quebec, English Canada sits at the doorstep of this cultural behemoth to the south. Without government support, I'm not sure what kind of filmmaking industry we would have. I'm not sure how our music industry would have established itself 20, 30 or more years ago, and which is now established, but it needed a lot of support because of the huge influence that we face. And is journalism not an essential thing to defend democracy, to fight against misinformation and disinformation? If the answer to those questions is yes, what's wrong with government providing support? Now, yes, it has to be done in a way that protects the integrity of the journalism. I worked at the CBC for many years. I never once, and Allya can pipe in on this too, never once did I feel some pressure to bend a story I was working on or supervising to follow the government's line of the government in power. Marie-Maude,
quite the opposite. Usually, generally, we're
That's right.
going at the government. That's
Well, just look at 2
right?
weeks ago. What's dominated Parliament is the scandal with the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, and the hacking, and that's a CBC story, right?
If the state specifically,
it's the state specifically.
And
Paradise
we've
Papers,
gone at it week after week.
so
We've done 5 follows.
Yeah, with the Star and CBC. So, but
I
Cecil,
and I do think though, there's a danger. There's a potential danger of it. And now that I'm no longer at the CBC, I can express the following types of views that I think the government could do more to separate government and CBC. Like government directly appoints the CBC president. Government directly appoints the board of the CBC. So I think there are other mechanisms there.
Cecil, I see a danger in any source of financing. If we look at it frankly, let's say it's philanthropy. Wouldn't a certain type of people be more inclined to donate, well-meaning people? But what happens if we investigate on the conductor of the orchestra, or in this little group of well-meaning, wealthy people? Wouldn't that be dangerous either, to rely on a certain group of people? And it's not only the CBC. I think we have to make sure the mechanism by which the government allows some subsidies is truly independent. And I confirm that I never felt like the hand of the government looking over my shoulder at CBC and Radio Canada. But as the government is stepping in, because you're absolutely right, journalism is not a consumption good as a TV, as a stereo. It has a value that is beyond economics.
Yeah,
but how do we?
I'm sorry, Julian. Just one last point. Like when we're talking about the CBC, there are other things I think ought to happen. Like CBC's funding should not live on a year-to-year appropriation basis on the part of government. And that can lead to not direct interference in editorial policies, but direct say in how much funds are appropriated to the CBC and to Radio Canada. Like the BBC has a better model, in my view, and I think some work needs to be done to figure out a more independent mechanism to fund public broadcasting in Canada and to fund other media in Canada, so that it is a public good. It is necessary for democracy. The public, in my view, should fund it, and we should have really robust mechanisms in place to protect the integrity of the journalism against the things you're referring to, Marie-Maude. I totally agree with you.
Rob?
I mean, I'll just say, I actually don't have any concerns that the government would directly attempt to interfere in stories. Like, it would be suicidal. It would be the stupidest thing you could possibly do, to pick up the phone and call the editor of the Globe and Mail and say, we're giving you money, how dare you? Because that's obviously the next story, obviously. But here's the thing. we have a perception problem. We obviously have a
Totally.
perception problem.
Totally.
And in the minds of many Canadians, what's very clear is that there is an appearance of conflict. It comes up again and again. Read the comments on stories, right? Just pick a paper, pick a political leaning, and read the comments. There is a absolute, and I get this all the time now. I never had this happen to me ever. But people reach out to me and say, I have a really good story here. I think you should do this story. Are you going to be allowed to do this because it's critical of the government? Like tipsters now, right? Regular Canadians now believe that we as journalists in this country are restrained from pursuing important public interest stories because they know that the Toronto Star or the Globe, all of us are getting this government money. That's a problem. So, I mean, I think we do have to address it. We can't just say, it's no big deal. They'll never touch us. We're journalists and we have integrity. The point is, if we're going to take the money, at the very least, we have to communicate much better around what our values and core protections are to ensure that Canadians understand that they're, I get it. There is an appearance of conflict, and appearances of conflicts are important. Journalists write about it all the time. We love appearances of conflict. We have an appearance of conflict, but right, we are now the subject of that, and I just think we have to address it.
I think Rob raises an important point, because look at Pierre Poilievre, when current polls show he could be the next prime minister. All prime ministers have attacked the CBC. That's par for the course. But, there was this famous incident recently where he refused to answer a question from a Canadian press reporter, berating the Canadian press as being a tax-funded mouthpiece for the Liberal. The Canadian press, you can't imagine a more neutral kind of just almost blah news agency, because it has to deal with the whole country, right? The Star has its politics, the National Post has its politics, but it's the Canadian press. So Poilievre is picking on something that is out there. And,
okay, Julian, almost 10 years ago, a former US president, soon to be US president, planted the seed that journalists are enemy of the public. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely agree with Rob. We have to address this idea that journalists as a whole are working against the regular people, against the people. And it's funny how after all these years, I hear a bunch of hatred against the media as a whole, but like individually, they super respect our work. So I think it's a matter, like, we have to defend ourselves from this idea. We have to defend the idea that the true freedom, because everybody claims themselves to be the owner of the freedom concept, we have to ally with popular people. We have to ally with people who are successful in business or arts, who are popular, who see the value of journalism, of real journalism, not show business journalism.
I'd add to that too, Marie-Maude. We have to, point to the facts. Like, investigative journalism is basically a cliche at this point to say, we hold power to account. Well, who's in power? That's who we're holding to account. If you look at the city, if you look at Enquete, we pretty much exclusively do negative stories about the current government. We haven't done a positive one yet, because that's not the nature of the job. So it is also, to me, pointing to, where in this body of work, where in this CRA file, where we're saying, the CRA is broken and it's leaking like a sieve, where in that is that positive? Or is that pro any given party? It's not, right? So the work we're actually doing bears the facts out, but as Rob said, is a perception thing, and I think we have to push back at that. Like, where is it? Where is the actual evidence for this perception? There isn't much of it.
Well, this bleeds well into our final theme. We have maybe about 15 minutes before we can open it up to questions from the audience. And we're talking about how we move out of this crisis and maybe change things for the better. We talked about the government funding and both the challenges and risks, but there's also been a lot of new initiatives. Cecil and Rob, you both have created very successful foundations, which again, 10 years ago, none of us would have thought there'd be excellent investigative journalism coming out of these private and publicly funded foundations. Can you both talk briefly about your foundations, the financing, how robust they are, and how much of a future model is this for some investigative journalism? Because, you know, Post Media is not going to be plowing millions of dollars into investigative journalism in Canada. Cecil, why don't you start with the Winnipeg Foundation?
Yeah, well, just to correct the record a little bit. So the Investigative Journalism Foundation was created by our CEO, Zane Schwartz. It's very new. We're a virtual newsroom. I'm in Winnipeg. We have journalists in BC and in Ontario. We have people spread across the country, Alberta, and we operate virtually. But Zane Schwartz created this foundation and has built it into quite a formidable media outlet in Canada, I would say, right now. We are currently doing collaborative pieces with the CBC and CTV, and we've done them with the National Post, with the Tyee, and with many other organizations, even though we're operating with a very small team. What frees us a little bit to do those types of things and to do good investigative work is, we don't have all the burdens of legacy news organizations. We don't have a printing plant. We don't have to buy reams of paper and ink. We don't have to set up a gigantic broadcasting towers and networks anywhere. And of course, in the internet era, you know, the barrier to entry has gotten easier in that respect. But I think the other key thing is we don't feel an obligation to cover breaking news, to cover every press release that rolls in, to cover every press conference. We want to, Canadians are inundated by that material. Even if every breaking news reporter stopped covering things tomorrow through your Twitter or Blue Sky or TikTok or YouTube feeds, we would find out what Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre are saying and doing. The key thing is to really figure out what they're doing, is to investigate their statements, to figure out whether their statements are true or not. So that's what we concentrate on. And the way we finance ourselves is by raising funds in any ways we can. There are these government subsidies we talked about earlier. We approach foundations and have been very successful at doing that. We have academic partnerships with academics that can unlock other streams of funding. In 2003, we raised about $1 million. In this fiscal year that just ended at the end of October, we raised about $1.7 million. It can be done. We're one of a number of startups, journalism startups across Canada. It's very refreshing for me because I've worked in legacy media organizations my whole life to now be involved in a small we're a nonprofit. Our aim is not to turn a buck. It's to do good journalism, and it's to hold power to account, and we're concentrated on accountability. Will we succeed in the long run? I mean, who knows? So far, we've been successful at raising enough money to employ quite a number of folks for a small organization, and I think we've produced some outstanding pieces of journalism so far, which I invite everyone to go check out.
So, and we'll put a link to it up, obviously, on the CFE page. But just so we clarify things for the audience. So you're raising money from private sources, public sources, academia. You do the journalism, and that gets shared with either legacy media like the CBC or newspapers, or online new media like the Tyee.
Yes, and one last thing that is very important, like one of the most one of the core things we do, and the most unique, I think, thing we do is we accumulate and curate and constantly update public interest databases that we make available to the public so people can do their own investigation as well. And they're things related to political donations and lobbying. We put out a weekly lobbyist newsletter. So people procurement. So government procurement. So people on their own can go and check and see, hold their own governments to account. And then we have a team of journalists that derive stories from those databases as well.
Rob, for years, if not decades, from the time you were president of the CAJ, you were always fighting to figure out a way to copy or be inspired by what the Americans have, these journalism foundations. Tell us about the success of the IJB. I should say conflict of interest. I'm on the advisory board of the IJB. But tell us how it works and what its success has been.
Yeah, we've been operating now for 5 years, 6 years. We are based at the University of Toronto, so we are affiliated. We have a home base with an educational institution. We have a two-part mandate, which is first to do a groundbreaking investigative reporting the public interest through a unique collaborative model, bringing in academics, students, and news organizations. And secondly, to train the next generation of investigative reporters. So training is a big part of our mission and mandate. We've trained a number who have gone on to do remarkable things. I'm very proud of it. I think it's a novel model. We bring in students, not just in Canada, but across the US. We've had students from Stanford and CUNY and Temple and Syracuse working on big projects. We've had as many as 80 students at one time working on projects with us across 2 countries, hoping to expand that further. Numerous national awards, impact,
big awards,
policy. We just won a big Signal Award, the big International Podcasting Award for podcasting. We've gotten into documentaries. We just did a documentary on CBC. Work with TVO, Toronto Star. So we work with big media partners, which gives us reach. What we're interested in is reaching millions of people rather than a few hundred, right? So it's the combination of strong educational mission, the gravitas and academic connections of the university and the academics who provide us with unique data and access. And we do all the work in the middle and then partner with big media organizations on the other end.
What's fascinating about it's not just the amazing journalism, and as I said, we'll put a link up so people can see the amazing stuff you've done. But when you mentioned 80 or more journalism students, that's the next generation, right? We're seeding the next generation of investigative journalists who will go on in new media in ways we can't imagine to do the work that all of us have been doing for so many years. Which leads me to the final point I want to raise. We could look at different numbers, but the recent American election, I'm not talking about the politics, just the media, was often called, and it's a shortcut, so it's not entirely accurate, as all shortcuts are, either the TikTok election or the cell phone election, in that you saw the major candidates. Yes, occasionally they would sit down with the big legacy media, but they went on these podcasts and new media that many traditional journalists had never heard of, right? Or hugely powerful ones like the Joe Rogan show. So I want to end with asking all of you, even the foundations to some degree are still dealing to some degree with legacy media. We have, Radio Canada and Enquete and the Fifth Estate. How important do you think is it for your work and figuring out ways to reach that new young audience that is not watching or reading legacy media and getting those investigative journalism stories, which are often complicated, onto platforms that often can't deal with complexity? So I open it up to to all of you. Allya, maybe you could start, because
I'm
the
happy
Fifth
to.
Estate has to, you grapple with that of getting your material out.
Of course, yeah. And, I think about it every day. That is, we aren't doing this work for ourselves so we can think what a nice job we did and pat ourselves on the back. It's for the public. So if people aren't consuming it, that's a problem. I will say the Fifth Estate, we really emphasize new media. We are on TikTok. Bob McEwen is on TikTok. You do see those breakdowns of our stories. And I think part of it is, on the part of new media, we have to get past these often incorrect assumptions about those platforms and about how young people use them. We are,
Mhm.
we are not doing 90 seconds. Bob's not on TikTok dancing for 90 seconds. We're doing 7, 8, 9 minute TikToks and people are watching them and they're sharing them. They are interested in that information. They're clicking through and then they're going to our YouTube channel. We really, really put a lot of work into our YouTube channel to tailoring the way we present our content there. And people will watch. We have huge retention on YouTube. People will watch for 20, 25 minutes of our docs on YouTube. And we have nearly a million subscribers on YouTube as well. So, young people
Wow.
are interested. I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say they're not interested. For me, it's how we're presenting the investigative journalism. It's not the actual information that's a problem. Because if you think about any number of big Netflix docs that have been popular, Wild Wild Country, any number of them, they were investigative, but they're just not packaged in this staid, your dad's going to tell you how the world works way. And I think that's the part that we have to kind of look at, as opposed to the gathering and the information, because people do want that information, I think, from a show like Fifth, where they know we have the rigor, we're fact checking. If we mess up, we have an ombudsman. Like, there are checks and balances there, and people do want that. So I think about it all the time, and I think that's not even the future, that's now. So, we are on TikTok, we were on Instagram, we were on Facebook, we're obviously not anymore, but I treat those platforms with a seriousness. It's not sort of an, oh, eye roll, let's do TikTok. Let's do TikTok.
Do you release your YouTube videos at the same time or ahead of time of broadcast?
We actually release them before the broadcast. So we
That's amazing.
have an email newsletter that goes out Fridays at 1. Go to our website to subscribe. And in that newsletter, 1 o'clock Eastern, you get a YouTube direct link to each week's doc that then airs on TV, that night at 9. Because to me, this idea of cannibalizing your TV audience, complete misnomer. People who are going to watch on YouTube, we're never going to watch it at 9 o'clock on CBC TV. They are different audiences, and that's been borne out in the numbers, frankly.
Marie-Maude, Enquete?
Well, Enquete, we got all. I think the Fifth is a bit ahead of us in like the newsletter and releasing on YouTube before the show actually airs. But we're on TikTok. But Radio Canada is it's a big box, and we have like dedicated staff to do like what we call the merch, the merchandise that is not the TV show. I just want to pick up on something Allya said about people trust us because we're Radio Canada, we're CBC. That's true, but we're competing with a growing documentary industry on Netflix and all other platforms. Disney, name them all. All the major, the major international platforms are producing some kind of documentary, or it sounds like investigative. We like, and with a very fun way to tell the stories that we can't match because we have GSPs, we're scared of lawsuits, we don't have the same budget. So it's really hard to say to people, come and look at Good for Your Health show, well done, well crafted here in Canada. So it's a challenge. We still manage to do it, but I think that's a growing concern for me. And the other thing is that, the cost of telling good stories on TV is very high. And we've talked about government subsidies, but there's very, very simple things, free things the government can do to support Canadian investigative in television. I will speak for television for 1 minute. Did you know that on certain cheap smart TVs now, that you can't download the apps you want? You buy a TV and the TV is now deciding what you are going to watch. So the CRTC, way back when broadcasting was regulated by the government, they said, okay, so here's this new thing called TV, and there's the cable. So channel 2 is going to be CBC, and channel 3 is going to be CTV. And, all the Canadian channels are going to be, first, the first numbers on your remote control, or your thing to put to pick the channel. Now, there's no regulation. There's government regulation to determine what kind of energy, Energy Stars certified, or there's all kinds of government regulation for your TV in your living room, but there's not one regulation to say the Canadian channels will appear on the first place of every TV bought in Canada. And that is a huge problem. And that is a huge challenge, because what do regular parents like me do when they're stuck preparing the meal or doing the the chores in the house? They stick their kids in front of the TV and hope for the TV to raise your children well. So when you have to download an app that every time your TV refreshes, it can, toss your Canadian app after the Disney, Netflix, and whoever is paying, because on your main menu, it's it's auctions. It's all what you're willing to pay. Your Panasonic, your Sony. This is a huge thing, and the government could do the simple thing, and is to compel the Sony and the makers of TV of the world to put Canadian channels on the first page. That was all for my political platform. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an
Cecil,
interesting point, Marie-Maude, because we, CBC, we have a streaming channel, CBC News Explore, where you don't need cable anymore. You just log on. It is an app. It's right there within, the Roku and all these devices. And, I've set it as a favorite, so it's there when I turn on the TV. But for other people, it's not.
And do you know who's getting the dollar of these streaming channels, of the advertisement? It's the makers. CBC is not getting the money from these advertising of our streaming channel, or a very little share. It's the makers that get the money out of that advertising. This is very serious, guys.
And so,
Cecil, I want to end with you, because you talked before, because you spent 3 decades in old legacy media, and now with your foundation, you were talking about how in many ways you're bridging the gap, right? Because you're working with new media, still upholding the traditional standards. So how do you see the future of ensuring that we're reaching younger and different audiences that we weren't reaching before?
Yeah, it's not just a matter of platforms or technology. Like it's content too. Like, what is the content that young people want? Like, we've talked about the Investigative Journalism Foundation and the Investigative Journalism Bureau. There are several dozen startup journalism organizations in this country that are very successful. The Narwhal, the National Observer, and the TIE, and you can go on listing them. And one of the reasons, I think, for some of their success is they are tackling topics that bigger mainstream organizations don't devote enough attention to, whether it's the environment or climate change or labor. And I see this as a very positive development. We are you can think about it in a niche way, but because of the collapse of big mainstream media outlets, you don't have education reporters and you don't have climate reporters. And so there's a need, there's a void, and it's being filled by some of these startups. I feel we're filling a void of intense scrutiny of government through things like lobbying and donations and so forth. And there's room to grow there for other startups that want to tackle particular niches that mainstream media outlets are not paying attention to, and that young people want media to pay attention to. And I think that's part of the that's part of the equation here.
That's a perfect way to segue to questions from the audience. We started with a lot of despair, but I hope we ended with a lot of hope and initiative. Why don't you read us our first question? Let me remind people, I hope you've been posting questions throughout our conversation, but please continue to post the questions either to an individual panelist or to all of them. Ange, what's our first question?
Yeah, the first question is from Bill. Bill says, there's a mountain of serious declarations in Canadian jurisprudence, government reports, political speeches, and scholarly writing about the news media being a weight-bearing pillar of a functioning democracy and the airwaves belonging to the public. Is there a role for the CRTC and Parliament to guarantee a modicum of funding for investigative news gathering or mandating a minimum portion of revenue to investigative news?
I mean, Marie-Maude talked a bit about that, what the government could do. Anybody want to tackle that? Could the CRTC mandate or figure out a way to encourage specific funding to investigative journalism? Cecil, you might know more about the laws than we would.
I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about the obligations of some of the corporations that have caused a bit of this crisis, and I'm talking Google, Facebook, and you know, the different big players that have hoovered up much of the advertising revenue that has led to a crisis in journalism. We know through Bill C-18 that there was an attempt to have the likes of Facebook and Google put some money on the table to assist the world of journalism because they benefit from it. And we know what the respective responses were. Google came to an arrangement and is going to be putting some money into the system. And Facebook said, sorry, we're picking up our toys and leaving. We're banning all news on our platforms. Fake news can live on our platforms. Real news, not so much. Yes, I think there is an obligation there, and these outlets should be taxed. There's also a controversy about that. We already have the precedent of benefits being being ordered by the CRTC, for instance, of two different corporations to fund various aspects.
I know they're trying to, for various political reasons in the States, go after big tech, but does the CRTC have any jurisdiction over Facebook? Because, imagine like Facebook deciding it's not going to just imagine if Rogers, right? Or one of the other big telecoms just decided CBC and CTV is no longer going to be available to our subscribers, right? Because people don't want news. That's what Facebook did,
I'm no expert of the CRTC, but let me stress this again. Google are now broadcasters, via those smart TVs. Like all the GAFAMs are now broadcasters using it's digital now, but it's the same principle that used to exist before with public, with radio and TV. It's the same thing. So they should be under the jurisdiction of the CRTC.
I should also say the to answer to go back to the question from Bill, Bell Media, got millions in subsidies, and then when they slashed not just W5 but thousands of jobs, Trudeau and other politicians, regardless of their politics, Trudeau called it a garbage decision, and yet nothing came of it, right? I mean, they basically shuttered newsrooms across the country after getting millions and also after making obligations to the CRTC. All right, Bill, I hope that answered. Yep, sorry. Yeah, Rob?
Say, before we just sort of pass over C18 and the fact that the government attempted to do just that, it said to the big tech, you got to pay for this. And it has been an unmitigated disaster. The intentions were good, I get it. But like people, the only way people see our stories now is on in the scroll, and they see the headline and think, I'd like to read that story now. And then they click on it and they can't read the story. It's been devastating. Let's just not underplay the impact of the horror for newspapers of what's occurred here. Millions of Canadians now click on the Toronto Star story or the Vancouver Sun story, the Edmonton Journal story, and they can't see it. You know what that does, like, to the readership? This is the screen that shows readership in the newsrooms across the country. It's devastating. So it's a fraught problem. This notion that we can wave a magic wand in Ottawa and tell everybody to give money to investigative journalism because it's the right thing to do. I think that's a fiction. It's a fairy tale, and it's been proven now.
I mean, Rob Cribb can do this amazing investigative story, and if he wanted to share it with his family or friends or the public and put it out on Facebook,
my mother in Halifax can't read my work.
So it's quite a scandal. All right. Glad we're getting into upbeat questions. Question number 2, Angie.
Yeah, the next one, an attendee says, while the positives of government subsidies are admirable, does the financial safety net reduce radical initiatives to take risks and break barriers to reach a wider audience that not having subsidies could potentially inspire?
I think it's a good question. And Rob and others touched on it. And let me add to that, because Rob pointed out quite likely that if a government, because of the subsidies, called up the Toronto Star or the CBC and said, we don't want you to do this story, and we're giving you a lot of money, that would be a scandal and would probably be leaked and come out. But look at it from the other point of view, a private owner or even a CBC executive. But let's look at look at the controversy over Jeff Bezos, right? Bezos, according to Marty Baron's book, the Washington Post publisher, was quite good when he saved the Washington Post. He did not interfere in the journalism. He let them investigate Amazon, and was quite independent. And yet we saw, according to Marty Baron, former publisher, and others, in part people feel because of his fear of his business relationships with a future Trump presidency, he intervened and stopped the Washington Post from, publishing an endorsement of Kamala Harris. So I guess the question is, with these government subsidies, I doubt a Trudeau or a Polyev would call up the Star and ask them not to run something, or the Globe, or one of the foundations. But couldn't an executive saying, be a little less keen to do an investigation, worried about being cut off from vital government funding? Rob or anybody else, do you see that?
I'll jump on this.
Yeah.
I mean, just to say, no, we need money to be able to take risks. That's kind of the beginning and end of it. It costs a lot of money to pay journalists to work on something for 6 months that you may or may not broadcast in the end. And, if you don't have a lot of money, that is when you become risk averse, because every single thing you pursue has to be as close to a sure thing as possible. And that's not really possible in investigative journalism. Not everything is going to pan out, but when the margins are so razor thin, they kind of have to. Obviously, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone with a weekly show that still broadcasts. So, Friday at 9, there better be something on the show every week. And if there's just enough money to do that, that does impact the level of risk you can take on the stories. But if there's lots of money, then you can try things and you can be creative.
Okay, we've got 3 or 4 more questions. Ange, let's try to get to as many of them as we can. Next one.
Okay, the next question is from Margot. Margot asks, what is the best way to improve the ability of the public to discern legitimate journalism from disinformation campaigns? And what's the best way to counter the attacks on the media from conservative and populist politicians?
Excellent question. Anybody want to tackle it?
Yeah, start by buying a subscription to a newspaper. That's a good first step. In terms of discernment of legitimate from illegitimate news, I mean, this goes to your source, right? I mean, it's as old as time. Where are you reading it, and who's writing it? And the one comfort that you can draw from reading the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star or the CBC is that those are professional journalists who go through rigorous amounts of work and time and due diligence and fact checking and triple checking to get it to your eyeballs. And so to me, that's not a complicated question. Just go to legitimate sources. That has not changed with the internet. There was always nonsense. There was always lies. There was always propaganda. Like, this is Orwellian. Just go to the legitimate sources. I wish, here's the one thing I wish Canadians understood. There seems to be this notion that we wake up in the morning and come up with some notion about what we might be interested in writing about today and craft a few sentences in our underwear, and then it's in the newspaper the next day. Like, the rigor that we go through. I work with academics now, and they're like, we go, this is worse than what we go through. Like, it's worse. What you go through to get something in the newspaper is more rigorous than what we do to get a published scientific paper in a journal.
Well,
go to good sources, pay a little bit of money, and you've got legitimate information.
But Rob, with respect, you're talking about your investigative pieces, which are rigorously, deeply researched. Let's talk about the paper overall, or media overall, and breaking, daily reporters overall. When I was researching my book, I talked to a lot of people in the PR industry. You know what a lot of people told me? They're astonished, and a lot of these are former journalists. They said they are astonished that they write a press release these days, and then they open up the paper or the website of whoever and see great chunks of what they have written reproduced there without anyone bothering to verify or check. There is an enormous amount of peddling of influence that takes place by corporations, by companies, by governments, by politicians, by think tanks, by police departments, by the military, by you name it. And because journalism has been compressed, and because every reporter now has to feed, I was a supervisor of 4 reporters who I made serve multiple platforms. Where's your TV piece? Where's your radio piece? Where's your web piece? They had very little time in the day to actually check things. So I actually beg to differ. I agree with what you said when it comes to deeply researched investigative pieces. That's what you're doing. But if you're looking at the whole landscape, I think there's a legitimate concern on the part of the public that what they're reading may not be the real goods. And my advice to people would be amp up your media literacy. Learn more yourself about how to spot something that looks like BS. And I think it's incumbent on the public to do more and more of that. Otherwise, I provided a lot of examples actually, and came across them in my research, even of stories I supervised that I subsequently found weren't what I thought they were. There were errors and there was propaganda in them. And so I think that is a bit of an existential problem.
And so what you're saying is journalists make mistakes, is that right?
Not only that they make mistakes, but they don't, as much as necessary, as much as we should be doing, check the veracity of things that go into items.
What happens when journalists make
Cecil's also
mistakes?
saying, but I think,
what
Rob,
happens, what happens when they make mistakes? What do we do?
Hopefully we correct them.
We correct them, don't we? We make it transparent and open. We have a conversation that is ongoing with our readers. It is a relationship of trust, and we engage in a long-standing conversation that is serialized over time, which builds the trust. And in terms of the mistakes we make because of resource problems, yeah, that's a big problem. So maybe if we went back to a time when we subscribed and paid for it, those resource challenges would be addressed. No?
I'd love to see the public see in court when we're sued, because that happens, see how they dissecate every word we use in our stories. I think if the general public would see that, they would say, oh God, there's a lot more than what appears at surface. But I do agree with Cecil, and that's why we're all getting thrown in the same bag. That at the same time as that Cribb, that Rob and all kinds of Canadian investigative journalists are sweating blood and tears to put out sometimes a tenth of what they know. There's 24 hours news cycle media that pick up something on the internet. They read something from the internet. They report about what's written on entertainment sites on it's not high quality journalism all the time. It's not just there's
Most of the time, yeah.
yeah
We've
there's
got.
not
I,
always
I knew
high
I knew you
quality.
guys would be. I knew you guys would be great because you're all such strong journalists and opinionated. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm told there's about 2 more good questions. So let's try to get to both of them. And next question.
Too many good on how many?
The next question, there was actually a few versions of this one. So I'm just gonna combine them. There's this one. The Fifth Estate, Enquete, the investigative teams at the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star are exciting, and the Investigative Journalism Foundation works with small outlets like the Tyee in Vancouver. That's important for national issues and Quebec provincial issues, and in Canadians' major urban regions like the GTA, Metro Montreal, Vancouver. But what about the hundreds of smaller towns like Timmins, Red Deer, Sydney, the Pass, Lloydminster, which are becoming media deserts, which have little or no media presence? What can be done to help ensure that their local issues are investigated and their residents are able to hold their politicians and power brokers accountable?
So
Allya, that's a
we
great
actually,
question for
yeah.
you because of what you did recently.
Yeah,
Tell
I
the
was going to
audience
say,
about
I
that.
didn't pay someone to ask that question, so I can now talk about our new initiative. We launched our 50th season. We're doing retrospective stuff. We're looking back, but we're also just taking the temperature of journalism, the number of outlets that existed in this country in 1975 when the Fifth Estate started. It's, a percentage, a rounding error now in comparison. So we've launched in the spring a news deserts project where we said, do you live in a news desert? Do you live somewhere where there is no local news, where you do not have someone who is sitting in on school council meetings or town council meetings? Tell us your stories, and we will come and we will investigate with you. And because of the way we packaged that promo, it actually was able to play on Meta properties. So that was great. It went really wide, and we were flooded with tips such that we're feeding them out to our colleagues in local newsrooms that still exist at CBC. And we have 2 full 1-hour investigations that have come out of them. We opened our season from Dawson Creek, British Columbia, a very, what seems like perhaps a small story, but was representative of what many small towns are experiencing, where they are having a murder crisis, a drug crisis in this town of 3,000. 12 people have been murdered in the last few years. No investigations, no follow-up, and no ability to hold anyone to account. There's one local reporter remaining who said, look, when I call the RCMP, they don't even call me back. They called us back. So, they sat down with Mark. We were able to push and get some of those answers, and I can say, more answers will be coming. Obviously, the Fifth Estate alone cannot solve the news desert crisis, but I think we do have to, again, think creatively about what a national investigation can be, because that Dawson story was very specific to Dawson, but I've heard from people from Sudbury or from Timmins or from other towns who said, that's my town. That is what we were experiencing. I felt seen by that story. So I think it's not always massive government business, all of these capital I investigative things. We have to think really broadly about how we serve the public, the entire public. So that's something we've taken on this season. Our second News Desert story will run in the winter, and then we'll ideally continue it just forever, as long as the show's on. So that's one thing.
I love that term, news. I love that term, news desert. Cecil, that you talked about how your foundation, you don't have to deal with the infrastructure and broadcast towers, and so does that give you the flexibility to choose or help smaller local stories that often wouldn't get the attention of a major media outlet?
Look, we're tiny compared to the CBC or the Toronto Stars, so it's impractical to think that way. Would we like to grow and be able to be in more communities? Yes, we're talking to, our aims are to talk to different players in some of the communities. why shouldn't, say, a local foundation in a city invest in journalism, especially in a place that has lost journalists over the years? Again, it comes back to, how are we going to approach this problem? Do we leave it to market forces to sort out? Well, we see what we get right now, if that's the case. We've got what we've got right now. All kinds of communities with zero journalism. So I think it's a combination of convincing governments, philanthropy, foundations, and maybe there's a lot of education that can happen through journalism. So by convincing a combination of players to invest in this, perhaps we can start rebuilding some of that coverage in small places. But I know for sure, if we leave it to the market to re-enter, it's just like leaving it to the market to have air service between, two small remote places in Canada. No, that's why you have regulation. And so it's a tough one. I don't pretend to have the answers for it, but I think we have to try.
We have one final question. I'm told it's a good one, and it asks for an answer from each of you, which will be a good way to end this terrific 90 minutes. Ange, what's the question?
Yeah, the next question is from Aiden, and they ask, they would like each of the panelists to describe what they feel is the story that they helped break, which best exemplifies the importance of investigative journalism in a democratic society.
Oh, it's a great question, because we talked about, we've been talking about money and subsidies, but there's a value. You can't put a dollar value on investigative journalism, but it has huge economic, political, and social impacts. All right. In any random order, anybody speak up. What's the one story you did that you think typifies how important investigative journalism is? Lots to choose from. Marie-Maude, you want to start?
Okay, well, you're gonna say that I have a mental problem here, but I actually did a great story about what I was telling you. The makers of TV, they're just like shutting out our Canadian local TVs, and I interviewed Pascal Saint-Onge, our heritage minister, and I interviewed like competing TV producers that hate themselves and in the real world, but for once they all came together around that issue. It wasn't like it was like an access investigative journalism. It was just like, hey people, we need to talk about this. A few years ago, I also did a story about the Canadian, not the Canadian, but the Quebec government's leases in for their offices in buildings owned by the private sector, and there was a huge corruption scam. And until this day, there has been police investigations, there has been all kinds of inquiries, but never anybody was charged criminally. And that's the example I give to people who are saying, hey, journalism is not that important, we should put criminals in prison. And I say, yeah, really? If you rely on police to arrest the criminals and on the justice system to put them in jail, you're gonna wait like forever. It happens sometimes, but not always. But being informed is a huge power coming back to the people.
Rob, you've done so many, but if you had to choose one that stuck with you.
It's impossible. I'll just point to one. I have recency bias with everything I do, so I like the ones that I just did. So we've just been publishing a series of stories on lead in drinking water in schools and daycares across Ontario, which has been a project I've been on for 10 years, trying to hammer away at it. And we created a database so that you can type your kid's school or daycare into our database and see all the lead test results. And many of them are terrifying. Lead is neurotoxin, leads to loss of IQ, cognitive development issues in children. It's a nightmare. I started getting interested when I had a kid and I realized about this, and I've been working on it ever since. But just in the last year, we've had some real breakthroughs, and it's the coolest thing, right? Because when we published that database, it got picked up by media outlets across Ontario, and they all did stories about it. And then just on a daily basis now, I'm getting numerous messages from parents saying, oh my God, I had no idea about this. I typed my kid's school in there, and I had a 69% failure rate with lead. And now all the parents are mobilizing and demanding, that the school pull out the lead and replace all the taps. And, there's all these like mini revolts going on across the province with parents who are now empowered for the first time. They never thought about this, same way I didn't think about it. And now, because they're empowered with this data that was hard fought, took years to get all this together. And it's this cool thing of like citizen empowerment, citizen journalism, where they're going out, and now we're writing about them. So it's just been like a remarkably satisfying.
We'll put links up to all these stories tomorrow on the CFE webpage. Cecil, you've had like 3 decades of experience at CBC and elsewhere, and of course your new foundation. Hard to pick one, but if you had to.
Well, I've been a boss for too many years, so I have to go back quite a ways to pick something I myself worked on, and which is sort of the flip side of what Marie-Maude was talking about, which is people who are put in jail who shouldn't be put in jail. So I'm going to talk about the David Milgaard story, which
of course
I did a lot of work on and co-wrote a book about. And honestly, there are I can't think of too many things that are more satisfying than playing some small role in helping set someone free who has been wrongly convicted. And it's not just Milgaard. Like, investigative journalists have done that with Stephen Truscott. The Fifth Estate has led the way.
Julian did Truscott.
Julian Sher.
Julian Sher.
Paul Moran with, these are iconic stories of investigative journalism. And Julian, they stay with you forever. Like you can't.
And talking about forever, for those who don't know, Cecil's talking about the David Milgaard case, one of the first wrongful conviction cases. There is a law now that is making its way, C-40, through Parliament, called the David and Joyce Milgaard, his mother. And what that law will do, because when Cecil was investigating Milgaard and myself and others at the Fifth Estate did Truscott and all these wrongful convictions, if you think you're wrongly convicted, you have to come to investigative journalists, because we're the only game in town. It took us years to investigate, but you still have to go all the way through the courts and the justice minister, and the justice system itself is investigating itself. Thanks to Cecil's work and the work of the Milgaards and others, this new law called the Milgaard Law will set up an independent body made up of independent people, not attached to the justice system, similar to what they have in Australia and Britain. So if you feel you're wrongly convicted, you don't go to the justice system that you think screwed you to review it. There'll be an independent body. It may not be perfect, we'll see, but that is a huge change. And I think it is true in part because of the work investigative journalists did. Allya, we should say the Fifth Estate, as Allya alluded to, is celebrating its 50th year. There'll be a public event in Toronto, which is massively sold out with hundreds of people next Thursday. But I believe next Friday, people can watch on YouTube and on TV a retrospective of 50 years of investigative journalism. So be sure to watch that. Over those 50 years, you weren't there for all 50 of those years.
Yes,
but
only 49 of them.
If you had to choose a story that you worked on at Vice, W5, the Fifth Estate, wherever, what would it be?
This is a tough one. As we've all said, I'm so glad, Cecil, that you brought up wrongful conviction, because I think that's a huge legacy of the Fifth Estate for sure. And this show and your work, Julian, and others' work have changed the way journalists approach it, changed the way the judiciary approaches these cases. So, that is something a legacy I'm proud, to be part of. As far as a story, I'd say a series I did at Vice, this is again just one that comes to mind. I could pick any number. Canada's Waterless Communities, where we kind of this was 2014-ish maybe, sort of brought to a younger audience a national spotlight to the drinking water crisis on reserve. So we went to several reserves. We actually stayed there, embedded, made it part of the doc that, you know, we ourselves were the crew living on reserve. We didn't have water to drink. We had to buy water to go live there at Shoal Lake 40, which Cecil would know, Nishkantika and others. And then we took that to then candidate Trudeau, and he actually made a campaign promise around that documentary series to, you know, clean up all of the, you know, 200 boil water advisories by X time. We all know how that went. He hasn't done it yet. But, you know, the idea that, you know, for me, it was important that, you know, young people actually do care about these issues. That is a deeply unsexy issue, right? Drinking water. People would not think that Vice would be interested or that our audience would be interested. And they were, and they are. So again, it was disproving these sort of fallacies that young people, I don't know, need videos about skateboarding or whatever people think it is. They really do treat the world around them with a certain seriousness, and I would say a certain hopefulness too. Like, that's the thing about investigative for me anyway. You know, there's the cliche of the like cynical guy in the trench coat and the hat, but at the end of the day, you can only do this work if you're hopeful and not cynical, because it is very, very hard work to be hopeful.
Perfect way to end. And it's interesting that all the stories you selected were about ordinary people and ordinary things like water, or drastic things like being in jail. And that in the end is what investigative journalism is all about. And that's the strength. It's telling the stories of ordinary people and impacts that change people's lives. On that note, I'd like to thank all the panelists and bring back Jim Turk from the CFE to wrap things up.
Well, thank you, Julian, and thank you to the panel. This was really quite an impressive discussion of a lot of important issues, and I'm really happy with how it ended, because it just, I mean, each of you could have probably given 20 equivalent stories of things you've been involved with, but that is why investigative journalism is so important in a democratic country. It's one of the best ways of holding power accountable. So thank you to all of you for participating, and I'd like to thank the audience as well for joining us this evening. I think you were able to participate in a really remarkable discussion. As Julian mentioned, a video of this conversation is going to be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow, along with a list of links and resources that if there were things you heard or you'd like to engage more about, will be guides. So references to the work that various panelists have done, as well as discussions about the issues the panelists addressed tonight, will all be available there. And the CFE website is CFE, for Center for Free Expression, cfe.torontomu.ca. Also, there'll be information about our upcoming events. The next one is going to be next Tuesday, November 26th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern Time. And it's going to be on a different topic. Its title is The Global Surge in Attacks on University Faculty and Students. What is to be done? There's a new film called 2024 Free to Think. It's a report on the state of academic freedom worldwide, and finds and details how scholars and university students face frequent and pervasive attacks on their academic freedom and the autonomy of their institutions. And this is not only in North America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and the panel is going to look at what are the causes of this and what are the consequences and what can be done. So I hope you'll join us next Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And in the meantime, you can keep up on all of our various events at cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Subscribe to your papers. Watch TV.
Fridays at 9.